Ezra Kane stepped onto the derelict vessel, his boots clanking against the cold metal floor. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, ozone, rust, something long dead. The emergency lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the shattered corridors that stretched ahead like the gutted ribs of a colossal beast. His drone, Trix, hovered beside him, its blue sensor light scanning the shadows. "This place is a tomb," Ezra muttered, adjusting the grip on his plasma cutter. The ship's ID, barely legible through the grime, read Ardent Dawn. He'd seen the distress beacon flickering on his scanner and thought there might be something worth salvaging. But now, standing in the eerie silence, he had the uneasy feeling that something was very, very wrong. Trix beeped. Unidentified life, signs detected. Weak. Cargo hold. Ezra frowned. The Ardent Dawn wasn't just abandoned. Someone, or something, was still here. He moved cautiously, his footfalls swallowed by the ship's cavernous silence. The deeper he went, the worse the damage became. Walls scarred with deep claw marks. Bulkheads crumpled inward, as if something had exploded from within. And the blood, dark, crusted trails leading toward the cargo bay. He reached the doors, forcing them apart with a groan of metal. The room beyond was wrecked. Crates overturned, shattered glass glinting under the dim emergency lights. And in the center, chained to the floor, was the source of the life signs. It was a creature unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. Small, barely the size of a large dog, it had sleek obsidian scales that shimmered faintly with bioluminescent blue veins. Its wings, tattered, bound in thick chains, twitched weakly. But its eyes, large, glowing with intelligence and pain, locked onto him with startling clarity. A quiet, guttural sound, somewhere between a whimper and a growl, rumbled from its throat. Ezra took a slow step forward. The chains weren't just metal. They pulsed with some kind of biotech, intricate patterns carved into the surface. Not simple restraints, containment. Someone had wanted this thing alive, but powerless. Trix beeped again. Energy depletion detected. Organism approaching critical failure. "Yeah, I can see that," Ezra muttered, kneeling beside the creature. He could feel the heat radiating from its body, the faint hum of suppressed power. Someone had abandoned it here, left it to die. A deep unease settled in his gut. He knew cruelty. The Imperium treated humans like vermin, fit only for scavenging their scraps. But this was deliberate. The dragon, because what else could it be, flinched as he reached out. But it didn't pull away. Ezra hesitated, then brushed his fingers against its snout. The moment they touched, a shock ran up his arm, not painful, but electric with something deeper, a flicker of something vast, ancient. And then, clank, a distant noise echoed through the ship. Ezra's instincts flared. He turned, pressing his back to a crate, hand tightening around his plasma cutter. Trix flickered. Multiple heat signatures inbound. Armed. Damn it. He wasn't alone. Ezra exhaled, weighing his options. He could leave, slip out before anyone saw him. But that meant leaving the dragon to die. He looked down. The creature's eyes were still on him. Not pleading. Waiting. Footsteps. Heavy. Closing in fast. Ezra made his decision. He grabbed the nearest restraint, fingers searching for a release mechanism. His scavenger's mind worked fast. Biotech locks, probably DNA-coded. No time to hack them. He pried a small panel open, exposing the tangle of circuits beneath. A well-placed spark from his plasma cutter. Crack. The first shackle snapped. The dragon flinched, then let out a weak, rasping breath. The footsteps were closer now. Voices, harsh, guttural. He worked faster. The second shackle. Sparks flew as he jammed his cutter into the locking mechanism. The metal groaned, then split apart. The third. Move and you die. The voice was cold, mechanical, and entirely too close. Ezra froze. He turned his head just enough to see the barrel of a plasma rifle pointed at his temple. The owner was a towering insectoid, chitinous plates gleaming under the dim light, its mandibles twitching in amusement. 3 more figures flanked it. Mercenaries, their armor patched and mismatched. "Step away from the cargo," the insectoid rasped. Ezra lifted his hand slightly, careful to keep his plasma cutter within reach. Didn't know this junk heap was under contract. The insectoid clicked its mandibles. "The cargo belongs to Lord Var. You, however, are an inconvenience." Ezra's mind worked fast. Var. He recognized the name. A high-ranking warlord in the Imperium Dominion. If he wanted this creature, then it wasn't just some exotic pet. It was valuable, which meant they wouldn't risk killing it. The dragon stirred beside him, still weak, but its eyes locked onto Ezra's. He saw something there, understanding. Then a pulse. Not from the ship, not from the mercenaries, from the dragon. The chain still clamped around its wings pulsed once, then detonated in a blinding surge of energy. The blast threw Ezra backward, knocking the mercenaries off their feet. The ship groaned, power flickering wildly. Ezra hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Distantly, he heard the dragon snarl. Not weak anymore. The insectoid warlord recovered first, raising its rifle. Ezra didn't think. He lunged, grabbing the barrel, wrenching it sideways as it fired. The shot scorched past his cheek, burning against his skin. The dragon leapt. In one savage motion, it latched onto the warlord's throat, claws tearing through armor like paper. The mercenary let out a strangled gurgle as the dragon unleashed a pulse of energy straight into its skull. The body crumpled. Ezra rolled, snatching a fallen pistol. He fired twice, catching another mercenary in the chest. The remaining 2 fled, shouting into their comms. Reinforcements incoming. Ezra swore. They had to move. The dragon stood beside him now, taller, energy pulsing faintly along its body. It looked stronger. It looked at him. Then, for the first time, it spoke, not in words, but in his mind. A whisper, layered with meaning. "Run." Ezra grabbed his plasma cutter, breath ragged. "Yeah," he said. Figured. Together, they bolted into the darkness. Ezra sprinted through the crumbling corridors of the ardent dawn, his boots hammering against the metal floor. The ship groaned around him, its ancient systems destabilizing further with each passing second. His stolen plasma pistol was still warm in his grip, the sting of burnt flesh on his cheek a reminder of how close he had come to being vaporized. Beside him, the dragon, Riven, as Ezra had decided to call it, moved with surprising agility for something that had been shackled moments ago. Its bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly, and though it was still weak, there was no hesitation in the way it kept pace. Behind them, the mercenaries regrouped. Their shouts echoed through the hollowed-out ship, distorted by the twisting corridors. They were faster than Ezra had hoped. He risked a glance at his wrist console. Trix's signal was faint but active. His ship, the Nomad, was docked a few hundred meters away on the outer hull of the Ardent Dawn. If he could make it there, they had a shot. A plasma bolt streaked past his shoulder, slamming into the bulkhead with a hiss of molten metal. Ezra cursed and shoved Riven forward. "Move!" The dragon snarled but obeyed, leaping ahead as Ezra swung around, firing a few suppressive shots. The mercenaries were well armored, their plating absorbing most of the impact, but it was enough to slow them. Ezra sprinted after Riven, lungs burning, legs aching. The passageway ahead forked. One side led deeper into the ruined ship, the other toward an emergency hatch. He skidded to a stop, barely catching himself on the wall. The hatch. It was a gamble. If it was still operational, they could use it to reach an exterior maintenance shaft that would take them straight to the Nomad. If it wasn't, well, he'd figure that part out later. Ezra slammed his fist against the control panel. A warning flashed across the flickering screen. Pressurization failure. External lockdown engaged. Not an option. Riven growled low in its throat, glancing toward the deeper passage. Ezra knew the look. It had felt something. Seen something. Not really the time for a hunch, Ezra muttered. But the mercenaries were closing in fast, and they were running out of options. He followed Riven into the depths of the ship. The air was colder here, damp with something Ezra didn't want to think about. The damage was worse. Jagged tears in the hull, signs of explosive decompression. Whatever had happened to the Ardent Dawn had been brutal, and the further they ran, the clearer it became that the ship had been a battleground, not just a derelict. Trix's voice crackled in his earpiece. Ezra, your vitals are spiking. What's happening in there? Little busy, he growled, pushing himself faster. Something about this place unsettled him more than the mercenaries. The walls bore deep, curved gashes, like something had been clawing its way out rather than in. They reached a large chamber, a secondary control room. Dark, save for the emergency lights casting eerie red glows across the consoles. The walls were lined with containment pods, most shattered. Inside, the remains of creatures unlike anything Ezra had ever seen lay motionless, some barely recognizable, others fossilized in grotesque poses. Ezra swallowed hard. What the hell happened here? Riven let out a low, reverberating growl, a sound Ezra felt more than heard. He turned, following the dragon's gaze. The far end of the room was sealed off by a reinforced door, half melted and warped. Beyond it, the faint hum of energy pulsed. Something alive was in there. A sharp, static-filled voice rang through the ship's comms. Ezra Kane. He stiffened. His name. That was never a good sign. The voice belonged to Varric, an old scavenger contact, one Ezra had worked with years ago. Don't make this worse than it has to be, Varric continued. That thing you're running with? It's got a price on its head big enough to buy you out of this miserable life. Ezra exhaled through clenched teeth. Figures. Varric had always been a survivor first, a friend second. If he was here, it meant he had tipped off the mercenaries, sold Ezra out the second it became profitable. Ezra glanced at Riven, whose glowing eyes flickered with something like comprehension. The dragon understood betrayal. Varric's voice took on an edge of amusement. You got nowhere left to run, Kane. That thing's worth more alive, but I'm not picky. A countdown began flashing across one of the consoles. Ezra recognized the sequence immediately. The ship was rigged to blow. The Ardent Dawn wasn't just some abandoned wreck. It was evidence, and someone wanted it erased. The mercenaries weren't here just for Riven. They were cleaning up loose ends. A low rumble filled the air as the ship's core began its overload sequence. The walls trembled, deep metallic groans reverberating through the structure. Riven turned to him, the meaning clear. Now what? Ezra had seconds to decide. There was no going back, no fighting through a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. But whatever was behind that reinforced door, that was a mystery no one wanted him to see, which meant it was exactly where he needed to go. Change of plans, he muttered. With a sharp kick, he blasted open a nearby maintenance panel, revealing a tangle of ancient wiring. He jammed his plasma cutter into the control node, sending a surge through the ship's failing systems. The reinforced door hissed and groaned, hydraulics failing, the locks disengaging. Behind them, heavy boots pounded toward the chamber. Ezra shoved Riven toward the opening. Go! The dragon hesitated only for a fraction of a second before leaping through. Ezra followed, slamming his fist into the emergency override just as the first mercenary rounded the corner. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the room flooded with pale blue light. Ezra turned, his breath catching. The space wasn't just another control room. It was a lab, untouched by time, pristine in a way the rest of the ship wasn't. The consoles still hummed with power, screens displaying alien symbols, genetic blueprints, anatomical schematics of creatures that bore a haunting resemblance to Riven. And in the center, housed within a transparent containment field, was something else. Another dragon, larger, older, and very much alive. It opened its eyes, the same glowing intensity as Riven's. And, for the first time, Ezra felt something that wasn't fear. It was recognition. Behind them, the ardent dawn began its final countdown. The containment field hummed with a cold, sterile light, casting ghostly reflections against the polished walls of the hidden lab. Ezra barely breathed. Riven stood frozen beside him, its bioluminescent veins pulsing in erratic patterns, eyes locked onto the figure within the transparent field. The second dragon, larger, its scales etched with scars of a lifetime beyond this prison, regarded them with a piercing intensity. It was the same species as Riven, but ancient, power radiating off it like a storm barely contained. And yet, beneath that raw energy, Ezra saw something familiar. Recognition. A heavy boom rattled the sealed door behind them. The mercenaries weren't wasting time. They brought breaching charges. Ezra knew their window was razor thin. He turned to the containment console, scanning the alien symbols. The interface was sleek, far more advanced than anything human-made. And it wasn't just a holding cell. It was a stasis unit. This dragon had been here for a long time. Riven let out a low, rumbling growl. Not Ezra, but at the controls. It knew what this was. Ezra didn't have time for guesswork. He reached out, fingers skimming across the illuminated surface. The symbols shifted, as if responding to his touch, and a faint vibration spread through the floor. Behind him, the breaching charge detonated. A shockwave of concussive force rippled through the room, sending Ezra stumbling forward as the reinforced door buckled inward. Smoke and sparks rained down. Figures moved through the haze, weapons raised. Varric stepped into view, flanked by two of the surviving mercenaries. His gaze flicked to the containment field, his scarred face twisting in a smirk. Well, you found a real prize. Ezra didn't hesitate. He slammed his palm against the console, triggering whatever emergency release he could find. The lab shuddered as the stasis field collapsed, energy crackling through the air. The dragon inside moved instantly. Not sluggish, not disoriented. It had been waiting. With a single, fluid motion, it unfurled its massive wings, their span darkening the room. The bioluminescent lines across its body flared with a deep, primal light. Its eyes snapped toward the intruders. Then it roared. The force of it was physical, a pressure wave that slammed into Ezra's chest, nearly knocking him off his feet. The mercenaries weren't as lucky. One was sent hurtling backward, his weapon spinning from his grip. The other collapsed, clutching his head in agony, as if the sound itself had cracked something inside his skull. Varric staggered but stayed standing, his face paling. Oh hell. Ezra moved. He grabbed Riven, shoving them both toward the exit as the larger dragon lunged. It moved like a force of nature, claws shearing through metal, tail whipping out in a devastating arc that sent debris and bodies flying. The room erupted into chaos, alarms wailing, conduits rupturing, flames licking up the walls. Ezra barely had time to duck as a slab of the ceiling crashed down, severing the chamber in two. Sparks and smoke obscured his view, but he knew what had happened. The older dragon had cut off the mercenaries, trapping them inside the collapsing lab. Varric's voice rose in a furious snarl from the other side. Kane, you. Another explosion swallowed the rest of his words. Ezra didn't look back. He ran. Riven kept pace, but there was something different now. A renewed strength, like whatever had happened in that room had awakened something deeper in the smaller dragon. They reached the final corridor, a docking access tunnel that would lead straight to the Nomad. The ship's self-destruct countdown echoed through the hull, automated warnings chiming in multiple languages. 3 minutes to total core collapse. Ezra skidded to a halt as the docking door loomed ahead. Locked, power failing. His stomach twisted. No, not now. He sprinted to the control panel, fingers flying over the rusted interface. Nothing. The ship was shutting down, taking every possible escape route with it. Trix crackled over his comm. Ezra, you're running out of time. Yeah, noticed, he snapped. Riven paced beside him, tail lashing. The larger dragon was nowhere in sight, but Ezra felt its presence still, somewhere in the bowels of the ship, finishing what it had started. A deep, reverberating growl snapped Ezra's attention back to Riven. The dragon stepped forward, eyes locking onto the sealed door. Ezra barely had time to react before a pulse of raw energy erupted from Riven's body. The air shimmered, and for a brief, impossible second, Ezra saw something bigger than reality itself. A flash of memories that weren't his, images that burned into his mind with the weight of something ancient, something lost. Then the door exploded outward, ripped from its frame. Beyond it, the void of space, and just beyond that, the waiting silhouette of the nomad. Ezra didn't stop to question it. He grabbed Riven, engaged his mag boots, and launched himself forward just as the gravity failed completely. Behind them, the ardent dawn shuddered in its death throes. They hit the airlock hard, Ezra rolling to absorb the impact as Riven tumbled beside him. Trix's voice rang through the ship's comms. You're in. Sealing the hatch, brace. The Nomad's engines roared to life, thrusters igniting just as the explosion consumed the derelict ship. Ezra caught a final glimpse of the ardent dawn tearing itself apart, fire and debris scattering across the void. And, just before the wreckage collapsed inward, he saw a dark shape, wings spread wide, disappearing into the blackness. The older dragon had survived. Ezra collapsed against the bulkhead, heart hammering. Riven lay beside him, chest rising and falling in steady breaths, eyes half-lidded. Trix hovered close. So, that went well. Ezra let out a breathless laugh, scrubbing a hand down his face. Yeah, he muttered. Sure, let's go with that. But even as the nomad accelerated away, something deep in his gut told him this wasn't over. Ezra sat in the dimly lit cockpit of the nomad, the hum of the ship's systems a familiar backdrop to his thoughts. His hands still trembled from the rush of adrenaline, the ghost of the ardent dawn's final explosion lingering behind his eyelids every time he blinked. Through the reinforced glass, the wreckage of the ship drifted like a dying star, its remains scattering into the void. Riven lay curled in the co-pilot's seat, its bioluminescent veins dim but steady. The dragon's chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, exhaustion clear in its form. The raw energy it had unleashed in that final moment, tearing the docking door apart with nothing but willpower, had drained it. Ezra still didn't know how it had done it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Trix's voice crackled over the comm. We got lucky, Ezra. Ezra exhaled through his nose. Yeah, feels like we burned through a lifetime's worth of it. Trix scoffed. You especially. You should be dead at least 3 times over by now. Ezra didn't argue. He glanced at Riven, watching the faint glow that pulsed under its dark scales, the way its tail twitched as it dreamed, if dragons even dreamed. There had been something in that ship, in that lab, something about Riven's kind that was more than just biology, more than just an abandoned experiment. Ezra turned his chair toward the console, pulling up the flight logs. Tell me we're not picking up any unwanted trackers. Trix made a thoughtful noise. I scrubbed our signal. Varric's ship got torn apart in the explosion. If he made it out, he's drifting in an escape pod somewhere, and I doubt he'll be in the mood to chase us anytime soon. Ezra leaned back, letting his head hit the seat. Small mercies. Silence settled between them, thick and weighted. Ezra wasn't a stranger to jobs going sideways. Salvage work always had a way of turning into survival work. But this felt different. Something deeper had shifted. He pulled up the scans he'd managed to rip from the Ardent Dawn before it went critical. The alien schematics, the containment logs, genetic blueprints of creatures like Riven. The data was fragmented, some of it corrupted, but one thing was clear. Riven wasn't a mistake. It wasn't abandoned. It was meant to die. The Ardent Dawn had been purging evidence, just like the mercenaries had been trying to do. Someone out there had deemed Riven, and others like it, a threat, which meant someone was still looking. Ezra clenched his jaw. Trix's voice softened. "You're thinking about what's next." Ezra let out a dry chuckle. "I think next found us first." He turned the screen toward Riven. The dragon had opened one eye, watching him with quiet intelligence. It wasn't just an animal, wasn't just some experiment left to rot in the dark. It was alive, and that meant it had choices. Ezra leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You saved our asses back there," he murmured. "Twice. I don't know if that means you trust me, but I'm not letting them take you back." Riven blinked, slow and deliberate. Then, after a moment, it lifted its head and butted it lightly against Ezra's arm. "A choice made." Trix made a small, amused sound. "Well, looks like you've got a co-pilot now." Ezra exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Yeah, guess I do." He turned his attention back to the NAV controls. "Set course for the outer rim. Deep space. Somewhere quiet." Trix hesitated. And after that, Ezra's lips curled into a humorless smirk. "We find out who thought burying this secret was worth killing for." He met Riven's glowing gaze and, for the first time in a long time, felt something dangerous coil in his chest. Purpose. The Nomad's engines ignited, and the stars stretched into infinity.